My name is Lydia Monroe, and I'm 32 years old. I'm sitting in an attorney's office in Portland, Oregon, 3 days after burying both my parents. And the lawyer just told me I've been completely cut out of the will. Everything goes to my younger sister Bethany. The mansion worth $3 million, the family business worth $5 million, the savings, the investments, the jewelry collection, all of it. I get nothing. The lawyer slides a letter across his mahogany desk, and I read my parents' explanation with trembling hands. Bethany needs it more. Lydia is strong enough without us. I look up, and across the table, Bethany meets my eyes with the faintest smirk playing at the corner of her perfectly painted lips, and in that moment, I realize this wasn't an accident. This was planned. Before we dive into how my entire life fell apart, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button because this story is going to take you on a journey through betrayal, manipulation, and the fight to reclaim everything that was stolen from me. And make sure you subscribe because what happens next will show you that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who destroy you the most. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The Monroe family looked perfect from the outside, the kind of family that appeared in Portland society pages at charity galas and fundraising events. My parents, Gerald and Constance Monroe, built their fortune in commercial real estate development over 3 decades, creating an empire that owned office buildings and shopping centers across Oregon and Washington. Our family estate sat on 2 acres of waterfront property, a sprawling mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Columbia River, worth every penny of its $3 million price tag. Growing up in that house, I learned early that appearances mattered more than reality, that image trumped authenticity, and that some children were simply valued more than others. I was always the responsible one, the daughter who did everything right and somehow still couldn't measure up. I graduated top of my class in high school, earned a scholarship to study architecture at the University of Oregon, and spent my college years working part-time at the family business to prove my dedication. I had dreams back then, real dreams of becoming an architect, of designing buildings that would transform city skylines and create spaces where people felt inspired and alive. But after graduation, when I mentioned pursuing a master's degree, my father looked at me with barely concealed disappointment and said the family needed me at Monroe Properties. So I put my dreams in a box, tucked them away on a shelf in my mind, and went to work managing properties and dealing with tenant complaints and reviewing endless financial spreadsheets. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go back to architecture someday, but temporary stretched into years and years, stretched into a decade, and suddenly I was 30 and my dreams felt like relics from someone else's life. 5 years ago, my father suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his left side and dependent on constant care. Without hesitation, I moved back into the family mansion, converting my childhood bedroom back into my living space, and became his primary caregiver. I managed his physical therapy appointments, monitored his medications, helped him with basic tasks he could no longer do himself, all while continuing to work full-time at Monroe Properties because someone had to keep the business running. My mother, Constance, seemed relieved to have me there handling the difficult parts of caregiving while she maintained her social calendar and her bridge club meetings and her carefully curated image as the devoted wife. I gave up my apartment, I gave up my social life, I gave up any chance of building my own family, and I told myself it was what good daughters did. Nobody ever thanked me. Nobody ever acknowledged the sacrifice. It was simply expected, the way the sun was expected to rise and gravity was expected to pull things down. Bethany, on the other hand, lived a completely different existence. 4 years younger than me, she glided through life on charm and beauty and an uncanny ability to make people want to take care of her. She tried being a fashion designer for 8 months before declaring it too stressful. She attempted interior decorating for a year before deciding her clients were too demanding. She spent 6 months as a lifestyle blogger before admitting she found it boring. Each failed venture was funded entirely by our parents, who wrote checks without question and made excuses about how Bethany was still finding herself. She married a man named Preston Caldwell when she was 24, a real estate investor from a wealthy Seattle family, and the wedding cost $200,000. And featured ice sculptures and a 12-piece orchestra and centerpieces with actual diamonds woven into the floral arrangements. The marriage lasted exactly 23 months before Bethany filed for divorce, claiming Preston was controlling and didn't understand her free spirit. Our parents paid for her luxury apartment after the divorce, a penthouse downtown with views of Mount Hood, and they covered her car payments on a brand new Mercedes, and they never once questioned why a woman in her late 20s couldn't support herself. The contrast between us couldn't have been starker, and everyone in the family pretended not to notice. I remember my college graduation, how I searched the crowd for my parents' faces, and couldn't find them because they'd decided to throw an elaborate Sweet 16 party for Bethany on the same day. I remember coming home for Thanksgiving during my junior year and overhearing my mother tell a friend that I was dependable but Bethany was special. I remember the time Bethany crashed her car while driving drunk and called me at 2 in the morning to come bail her out of jail, and when I picked her up she didn't say thank you, she just complained that I took too long. I fixed her problems, covered her mistakes, and watched my parents beam at her with a warmth they never directed at me, and I swallowed my resentment because good daughters didn't complain about unfairness. The dynamics reached a breaking point in the months before my parents died. My father passed suddenly 6 months ago, from a heart attack in his sleep, and my mother's health declined rapidly afterward. The doctors said it was cancer, an aggressive form that had already metastasized by the time they found it, but I think she died from grief because she couldn't imagine existing without my father to define her. I nursed her through those final 8 weeks, holding the basin when she vomited from chemotherapy, changing her sheets when she was too weak to get to the bathroom, reading to her when the pain medication made her confused and frightened. Bethany visited twice during that entire time, both visits lasting less than an hour, because she claimed hospitals made her anxious, and she couldn't handle seeing Mom like that. My mother never criticized her absence. Instead, during one of her final lucid moments, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're so strong, Lydia. You'll be fine no matter what." At the time, I thought she meant it as a compliment. I thought she was acknowledging my strength. I didn't realize she was using my strength as an excuse to abandon me. The attorney's office smelled like old leather and lemon polish, and Malcolm Fletcher sat behind his massive desk with the expression of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer affected him. He was in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and had been the Monroe family attorney for 20 years, which meant he knew exactly what kind of bomb he was about to drop. Bethany sat across from me in a black designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair perfectly styled in loose waves, her makeup flawless even though Wed supposedly just buried our mother. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue occasionally, but I never saw actual tears, just the performance of grief for an audience of one. Malcolm cleared his throat and began reading the will in a monotone voice that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Bethany was to inherit the family mansion and all its contents, valued at $3 million. She would receive the majority shares in Monroe Properties, giving her controlling interest in the business, with those shares valued at approximately $5 million based on recent assessments. She would inherit all savings and investment accounts, totaling just over $2 million. She would receive our mother's jewelry collection, including the diamond necklace that had been passed down through 3 generations, the pearl earrings from our grandmother, and the sapphire bracelet our father had given our mother for their 25th anniversary, all appraised at $500,000. I sat there doing the math in my head, watching the number climb higher and higher, $10 million in total assets being handed to a woman who had never worked a real day in her life. Then Malcolm paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at me with something that might have been pity, or might have been discomfort. "And to Lydia Monroe, nothing is bequeathed." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nothing. Not a single dollar, not a piece of jewelry, not even a photograph or a keepsake with sentimental value. I had been erased from my parents' legacy as thoroughly as if I had never existed. Malcolm slid a sealed envelope across the desk, and I recognized my mother's handwriting on the front. "Your parents left this explanation attached to the will." My hands shook as I opened it, and read the brief paragraph written in my mother's careful script. "To our daughters, we want to explain our decision. Bethany has struggled her whole life and needs the security that this inheritance provides. She has always been sensitive and requires protection and support. Lydia, on the other hand, has always been capable and strong and will succeed without financial assistance. We know she will understand that this decision reflects our deepest love for both our daughters and our desire to give each of them what they truly need. This decision is final and not subject to contest. We love you both. I read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't feel like a knife between my ribs. They had seen my strength and decided it meant I deserved nothing. They had mistaken my resilience for not needing love or support or acknowledgement. They had punished me for being the daughter who showed up. Bethany made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and pressed her tissue to her eyes. Lydia, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were going to do this. Her voice dripped with false sympathy, and I wanted to believe her, wanted to think my sister wasn't capable of such calculated cruelty. But then she looked up, and for just a fraction of a second before she remembered to keep her mask in place, I saw triumph flash across her face. She knew. She had known all along, and more than that, she had wanted this. I want to help you, she continued, reaching across the space between us like we were close, like she cared. I'll give you $20,000 to help you get on your feet. It's the least I can do. $20,000 out of $10 million. The insult was so profound I couldn't even process it. She was offering me pocket change and expecting gratitude. I stood up without saying a word because if I opened my mouth, everything I was feeling would pour out in a scream that would shatter the professional quiet of that office. I walked out with my spine straight and my head high. Exactly the way I'd been trained to carry myself my entire life. And I didn't let myself cry until I reached my car in the parking lot 3 blocks away. I sat there with my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and the sobs that came out of me were animal sounds, the kind of grief that comes from a wound so deep you can't see the bottom. I had given them everything. My youth and my dreams and my freedom, and they had looked at that sacrifice and decided it meant I needed nothing in return. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually someone tapped on my window, and I looked up to see a man in his 70s with kind eyes standing beside my car. I recognized him vaguely as Graham Mitchell, my father's former business partner from years ago, before Id started working at Monroe Properties. I rolled down my window and he leaned down slightly, his expression concerned. "Are you all right, Lydia? I was walking by and saw you look distressed." I must have looked terrible, my face blotchy and my eyes swollen, because he winced sympathetically. I managed to say I was fine, that I'd just come from a difficult meeting, and something in his expression shifted. "Was it about your father's estate?" "About the will." I nodded, unable to speak, and he pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to me. "Your father did the same thing to me 5 years ago. Cut me out of the business we built together after 20 years, used forged documents and manipulation to steal my share. If you ever want to know the truth about your family, call me." He straightened up and walked away before I could respond, and I sat there staring at his card with gold-embossed lettering that read Graham Mitchell, business consultant. I tucked it into my purse and told myself I'd probably never call, that I just needed to accept reality and move on, but even then, some part of me knew I was lying to myself. 1 week passed in a fog of numbness and disbelief, and I tried to figure out what my life was supposed to look like now. I was still living in the family mansion because it had been my home for the past 5 years, and I'd assumed I would have time to find an apartment and pack up my things and transition into whatever came next. I was still technically employed at Monroe Properties because nobody had officially terminated me, and I kept going to the office each day and managing spreadsheets and responding to emails as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal, and the fragile sense of routine I was clinging to shattered when Bethany showed up at the mansion on a Tuesday morning with a moving truck and a lawyer. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard vehicles pulling up the circular driveway, and I looked out the window to see a massive moving truck with the company name emblazoned on the side, followed by Bethany's Mercedes and a black sedan I didn't recognize. My sister climbed out wearing designer jeans and oversized sunglasses, looking like she was on her way to brunch rather than about to destroy my life, and a man in an expensive suit emerged from the sedan carrying a briefcase. I met them at the front door, confusion giving way to dread as I took in Bethany's satisfied expression. "What's going on?" I asked, and the lawyer introduced himself as Vernon Cross, his handshake aggressive and his smile predatory. "I'm here to serve you with an eviction notice on behalf of my client, Bethany Monroe, the legal owner of this property. He handed me a folder of documents, and I scanned them with growing horror. Bethany was evicting me, giving me 30 days to vacate the premises, but the notice was dated a week ago, which meant I actually only had 23 days left. I looked up at my sister, waiting for her to explain this was a mistake, that she wouldn't actually throw me out of the only home I'd known for 5 years, but she just adjusted her sunglasses and said in a voice dripping with false regret, "I'm selling the house, Lydia. I already have a buyer lined up and we're closing in 3 weeks, so you need to be out before then." 3 weeks, not even a full month, to find a new place and pack up my entire life. My mind raced through the logistics, and I grabbed onto the one piece of legal knowledge I had. I have tenant rights. You can't just evict me with 3 weeks' notice. Vernon Cross smiled wider, showing too many teeth, and I understood why Bethany had hired him. "Actually, Miss Monroe, you have no tenant rights in this situation. You're not on any lease, you've never paid rent, and you have no written agreement with the property owner. Legally, you're classified as a guest, not a tenant, which means you have no protection under Oregon landlord-tenant law. My client is being generous by giving you any notice at all." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I turned to Bethany, searching her face for any sign of hesitation or guilt or sisterly compassion. "Why are you doing this? Where am I supposed to go?" She had the audacity to look hurt by my question, as if I was being unreasonable for asking why she was making me homeless. "I need the money from the sale. The buyer is offering $2.4 million and closing quickly, and I have expenses to cover. You understand, right? It's just business." $2.4 million for a house worth $3 million, and the pieces started falling into place. "You're selling it under market value? Why would you take $600,000 less than it's worth?" Bethany's mask slipped for just a moment, irritation flashing across her features before she smoothed it away. "The buyers are Preston's parents. His family wants the house, and they're willing to close fast without inspection. It's the best offer I'm going to get." Suddenly, it all made sense in the most twisted way possible. This wasn't about money at all. This was about selling our family home to her ex-husband's family out of spite, about burning down everything that reminded her of a marriage that failed, and she didn't care that she was burning me in the process. Preston's family would get a bargain on a property they'd probably wanted for years. Bethany would get revenge in some convoluted way that only made sense to her narcissistic mind, and I would be collateral damage. The moving truck workers started unloading equipment, preparing to help Bethany move her things into the mansion even though she already had an apartment, and I realized she was planning to live here for the 3 weeks until closing. I would be forced out while she enjoyed the house one last time, extracting every bit of value from it before handing it over. I wanted to fight, wanted to scream and throw her out and call the police, but Vernon Cross stood there with his briefcase and his smug expression, and I knew the law wasn't on my side. I had no lease, no contract, no proof that I'd been promised anything, just years of sacrifice that counted for nothing in a court of law. I went upstairs to my bedroom and started mentally cataloging what I needed to pack, my thoughts spiraling into panic as I calculated the cost of deposits and first month's rent and moving expenses. My savings account held $35,000, which sounded like a lot until you factored in Portland's insane rental market, where a decent one-bedroom apartment cost $2,000 a month. But even in my panic, some instinct told me this wasn't just about the house. Something felt wrong about how eager Bethany was to liquidate everything, how quickly she was selling assets that should have been long-term investments. I thought about the family business and the shares she now controlled, and a cold certainty settled in my chest. She was going to destroy Monroe Properties too, either through incompetence or deliberate sabotage, and I needed evidence before it was too late. That afternoon, while Bethany was out celebrating her real estate deal with friends, I went to the office and systematically made copies of every important document I could find. Financial records, contracts, correspondence, balance sheets, tax returns, everything that told the story of how the business operated. I loaded boxes into my car and drove them to a storage unit on the outskirts of town, paying for 6 months in advance with my credit card. I didn't know what I was going to do with this information, didn't have a plan beyond protecting it, but my gut told me I'd need proof of something eventually. 2 weeks passed in a blur of apartment hunting and packing boxes, and I found a studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood for $1,500 a month, which was the best I could afford on short notice. It was 600 square feet with water-stained ceiling tiles and a radiator that clanked like it was haunted, but it was mine for now. I moved my essentials in over a weekend, said goodbye to the mansion where I'd grown up and where I'd sacrificed 5 years of my life, and tried to convince myself this was a new beginning rather than a catastrophic ending. At least I still had my job at Monroe Properties, or so I thought, which would give me income and health insurance while I figured out my next move. I showed up to work on Monday morning determined to maintain my professionalism despite everything, to prove I was the competent daughter they'd raised, the one who didn't crumble when life got hard. The illusion lasted until 10 o'clock when my desk phone rang, and Bethany's assistant informed me there was an emergency board meeting in the conference room and my attendance was required. I walked down the hall with a sense of foreboding, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. And when I entered the conference room, I understood this was an ambush. Bethany sat at the head of the table where our father used to sit, flanked by her lawyer Vernon Cross, and a man I didn't recognize with slicked-back hair and a calculator watch. Around the table sat the other board members. My Uncle Hugh, my mother's younger brother who'd always been more interested in access to family money than actual family relationships, Doris Hartwell, a family friend I'd known since childhood and thought I could trust, and 2 business advisors whose names I could never remember. Everyone looked uncomfortable except Bethany, who looked triumphant. She wasted no time once I sat down. We've called this meeting to address a serious matter that has come to our attention. Over the past 6 months, $50,000 has gone missing from company accounts, and our investigation has traced the discrepancy to transfers authorized by Lydia Monroe. The words didn't make sense at first, as if she was speaking another language, and I actually laughed because the accusation was so absurd. "What are you talking about? I haven't authorized any unusual transfers. I haven't stolen anything." Bethany nodded to the man with the calculator watch, who I now understood was some kind of accountant or forensic specialist, and he slid a packet of documents across the table. "My name is Franklin Werner, and I've been hired to audit the company's finances. These are records of 5 separate transfers totaling $50,000, each one bearing your digital signature and sent to an offshore account." I grabbed the papers and scanned them with shaking hands, my eyes taking in the dates and amounts and account numbers. And there at the bottom of each form was a digital reproduction of my signature. But I hadn't signed these forms, hadn't authorized these transfers, hadn't even seen these accounts before. "This is fake. Someone forged my signature. I never approved any of this." My voice came out too loud, too defensive, and I could see the board members exchanging glances that said they'd already decided I was guilty. Uncle Hugh, who I'd called for help with my college applications and who'd danced with me at my high school graduation, looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "Lydia, I've always known you resented Bethany. Growing up, it was obvious you were jealous of the attention she received. But I never thought you'd resort to theft. The betrayal from him hurt almost as much as my parents will, because I'd thought Uncle Hugh at least saw me as a person rather than just the disappointing daughter." "I didn't steal anything," I said again, but my protest sounded hollow even to my own ears. "How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate you didn't do something when evidence says you did?" Doris Hartwell, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke up in a quiet voice that dripped with pity. "Lydia, dear, if you just admit what you did and return the money, we can handle this quietly. No need to involve the authorities." But of course they'd already involved authorities of a sort by hiring Franklin Werner to build a case against me, and I understood with sudden clarity that this had been planned just like the will, just like the eviction. Bethany had been methodically destroying every aspect of my life, and this was the next step in her campaign. "I'm terminating your employment effective immediately," Bethany announced, her voice taking on a formal tone, as if she was reading from a script Vernon Cross had written for her. "Due to theft and breach of fiduciary duty, you're being fired for cause, which means no severance package. You have 1 hour to clean out your desk and leave the premises. Security will escort you." 2 men in ill-fitting security uniforms appeared at the conference room door as if they'd been waiting for their cue, and I looked around the table at people I'd worked with for years, waiting for someone to defend me or question Bethany's evidence, or at least express doubt about the narrative she was spinning. Nobody said anything. Uncle Hugh wouldn't meet my eyes. Doris studied her hands. The business advisors looked bored. as if employee terminations were routine and unremarkable. I stood up with as much dignity as I could muster and walked out of the conference room with the security guards trailing behind me like I was a criminal. I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, framed photos of architecture projects it admired, a coffee mug with the Monroe Properties logo, pens and notepads, and the small, succulent plant that had survived on my desk for 3 years. The security guards watched me the entire time, making sure I didn't steal office supplies or sabotage computer files, and when I finished, they escorted me through the lobby and out to the parking lot while my former colleagues watched through the windows. I loaded my box into my car and sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, my whole body shaking with rage and humiliation, and the crushing weight of understanding that Bethany had set the perfect trap. If I stayed quiet and accepted the termination, I was branded a thief and would never work in this industry again. If I fought back and tried to prove my innocence, Shed threatened to press criminal charges that could land me in prison even if they were based on fabricated evidence. I sat there in my car for 20 minutes, maybe longer, watching people walk in and out of the building where I'd spent a decade of my life. The sun was shining and birds were singing, and somewhere people were having normal days with normal problems, and I felt completely disconnected from that reality. I thought about driving home to my depressing studio apartment, crawling into bed, and never coming out. I thought about giving up, about letting Bethany win, because what was the point of fighting when the system was rigged and the evidence was fake and nobody believed me anyway? My phone sat in my purse with Graham Mitchell's business card tucked into the side pocket, and I pulled it out and stared at the gold-embossed letters. Head said my father had done the same thing to him, had used forged documents and manipulation to steal his share of the business, and if that was true, then maybe someone finally understood what I was going through. I dialed his number before I could talk myself out of it, and when he answered on the second ring, I said, "You told me to call if I wanted to know the truth about my family. I'm ready to listen." Graham Mitchell suggested we meet at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, neutral territory where we could talk without fear of being overheard by anyone connected to the Monroe family. I arrived first and claimed a corner table far from the windows, ordering a coffee I didn't drink and watching the door until Graham walked in carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. Had aged since I'd seen him at my father's business events years ago, his hair completely white now and deep lines etched around his eyes, but he moved with the energy of a man who had a purpose. He ordered tea at the counter and joined me at the table, setting his briefcase down with a heavy thud that suggested it was full of documents. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, my voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. Graham waved away my gratitude and studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You look like hell, if you'll forgive me for saying so. What did Bethany do now?" I told him everything. The whole sordid story spilling out in a rush. The will that left me nothing. The eviction from my childhood home. The fake embezzlement charges and termination from my job. Graham listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad he pulled from his briefcase, and when I finished, he sat back and shook his head with something between anger and admiration. "Your sister is following the exact playbook your father used on me. I mean, it's almost identical, which makes me think she learned it from watching him work." He opened his briefcase and began pulling out folders and documents, spreading them across our small table until it looked like a conspiracy theorist's war room. "Let me tell you my story first, so you understand why I'm willing to help you. Gerald Monroe and I founded Monroe Properties together 30 years ago. We were equal partners, 50-50 split on everything. We built that company from nothing, and for 25 years we were successful business partners and genuine friends. Then, 5 years ago, right around the time of his stroke, things changed. Gerald started cutting me out of decisions, holding meetings without inviting me, making deals I only found out about after they were finalized." Graham's hands tightened around his teacup, his knuckles going white. I confronted him, and he acted confused, said I was imagining things. But then documents started appearing. Contracts, I'd supposedly signed giving Gerald more control. Agreements to modify our partnership terms. Waivers of my voting rights. Every single document was a forgery, my signature traced or digitally copied, but sophisticated enough that proving they were fake would have cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees and years in court. "How did he get away with it?" I asked, fascinated and horrified by the parallel to my own situation. Graham smiled bitterly. "Money and connections. He had both, and he used them to systematically push me out until I had no choice but to accept a buyout for a fraction of what my shares were worth. I lost $2 million in value and my reputation because Gerald spread rumors that I was having financial troubles and making poor business decisions. By the time he was done, nobody in the Portland business community would work with me. He pulled out a photograph from his briefcase, an old picture of him and my father at some business event, both of them young and smiling with their arms around each other's shoulders. I spent 5 years investigating your father, trying to find evidence that would prove what he did to me. I never got justice, but I learned a lot about how he operated, and now I'm going to use that knowledge to help you. The first thing Graham showed me sent chills down my spine. He had documents related to my mother's will, papers he'd obtained through connections I didn't ask about, and he pointed to her signature at the bottom with a pen. Look at this signature compared to other documents your mother signed. He laid out 3 other papers with her name. A bank statement from 2 years ago, a property deed from when they bought a vacation home, and a birthday card Shed sent him years back. The signatures were similar but not identical, and even to my untrained eye, the one on the will looked somehow off. The pressure is wrong, Graham explained. Real signatures have variations in pressure, because the hand naturally adjusts as you write. This signature has uniform pressure throughout, which suggests it was traced. I think someone practiced your mother's signature, and then forged the final will. Who would do that? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Graham gave me a look that said I wasn't stupid and shouldn't pretend to be. Your sister, probably with help from whoever she's dating now. Do you know who she's been seeing? I shook my head, realizing I knew almost nothing about Bethany's current life because we'd never been close and the past few months had driven us even further apart. Graham pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd apparently taken from across a restaurant, a surveillance-style image of Bethany having dinner with a man I didn't recognize. He was handsome in a slick way, wearing an expensive suit and jewelry that screamed new money, and something about his smile set off alarm bells. His name is Victor Brennan. He sells luxury cars, but he's been investigated twice for insurance fraud and once for elder financial abuse. The cases never went to trial because the victims either died or refused to testify, but he has a pattern. He targets wealthy families in transition, befriends the vulnerable member, and manipulates situations to his advantage. The implications made my stomach turn. You think he helped Bethany forge the will? Graham nodded grimly. I think he saw an opportunity when your father died and your mother was grieving and vulnerable. I've been tracking his movements, and he started appearing at your family home about 8 months ago, right after your father passed. Security footage from the gated community shows his car visiting regularly during your mother's final months. He showed me grainy images from security cameras, timestamps proving Victor had been at the mansion dozens of times. Your sister introduced him as a friend who was helping with estate planning, but I think he was coaching her on how to manipulate your mother and change the will. I sat there absorbing this information, trying to reconcile it with what I knew about my family and coming up empty. My parents had been cold and had favored Bethany, but would they really have disinherited me completely? Or had Bethany and Victor forged documents while my mother was too sick and medicated to understand what she was signing? Graham must have seen the doubt on my face because he reached across the table and grabbed my hand. I know this is a lot to take in. I know you want to believe your mother made this choice consciously, but I've seen this pattern before, and everything points to manipulation. The question is whether you want to fight back or let them win. Before I could answer, a woman approached our table, and Graham waved her over with a smile. Lydia, this is Nina Sawyer. She's a forensic accountant I've worked with on several cases. Nina was in her 40s with sharp eyes behind practical glasses, dressed in a business suit that looked like it had come from a department store clearance rack rather than a designer boutique. She shook my hand with a firm grip and sat down without waiting for an invitation. Graham told me about your situation. I've already done some preliminary research on Monroe Properties financials, and I can tell you right now those embezzlement charges are fake. She pulled out her own folder, covered in post-it notes and highlighting, and showed me spreadsheets I couldn't fully understand. The $50,000 they claim you stole? It never existed. Your sister created fake invoices and transfer records, but if you track the actual money flow through the business accounts, there's no corresponding deficit. She fabricated the entire loss. Hope surged through me for the first time in weeks. Can you prove that in court? Nina smiled. I can prove it 6 ways from Sunday. In fact, I can prove something even more interesting. Your sister has been stealing from the company for the past 2 years, systematically siphoning funds to cover gambling debts and personal expenses. We're talking about $400,000 in total, hidden through various shell accounts and fake vendor payments. She framed you for embezzlement to distract from her own theft and to ensure you couldn't challenge her control of the business. She slid the spreadsheets toward me, pointing to highlighted entries that meant nothing to my untrained eye but apparently told a damning story. If we pursue this, we can not only clear your name but potentially have her charged with multiple felonies. Graham leaned forward, his expression serious. Here's what I'm proposing. We investigate thoroughly, we gather irrefutable evidence, and we expose every lie Bethany has told. But I need to be honest with you about my motivations. This is revenge for me. Your father destroyed my life, and I want to destroy what he built. If that makes you uncomfortable, walk away now, and I'll understand. I looked between Graham and Nina, these 2 people I barely knew who were offering to help me when my own family had abandoned me. And I thought about everything I'd lost in the past month. My inheritance, my home, my job, my reputation. Bethany had taken everything systematically, and she'd done it with a smile on her face and fake tears in her eyes. I thought about my parents' will and the message that I was strong enough to survive without support, and I realized they'd accidentally told the truth. I was strong enough, but not in the way they meant. I was strong enough to fight back. I don't care about your motivations, I told Graham. I care about the truth. If you can help me prove what Bethany did, then let's burn it all down. Nina Sawyer worked with the intensity of someone who genuinely loved unraveling financial mysteries, and over the next 2 weeks she systematically dissected Monroe Properties accounts with surgical precision. She'd obtained access to the records through legal channels I didn't fully understand. Something involving subpoenas and business partner rights that Graham still technically held from decades ago, and what she found was damning enough to make my head spin. We met in Graham's home office, which had been converted into an investigation headquarters with whiteboards covered in timelines and connections, and Nina walked me through her discoveries with the enthusiasm of a teacher presenting her best student's work. The embezzlement charges against you are completely fabricated, she began, pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop and projecting them onto Graham's wall. The $50,000 Bethany claims you stole never existed in company accounts. She created fake invoices from a vendor called Summit Solutions LLC, made it look like the company paid them for consulting services, and then doctored transfer records to show your digital signature approving the payments. But here's the thing. Summit Solutions doesn't exist. There's no business registration, no tax ID, no physical address. It's a ghost company she invented. Nina clicked to another screen showing bank records. The money she claims was stolen was actually just Bethany's personal gambling debts that she paid from company accounts. She was covering her tracks and decided to frame you in the process. But that was just the beginning. Nina had uncovered a pattern of theft stretching back 2 full years, starting shortly after our father's death when Bethany gained access to company accounts. She'd been stealing systematically, a few thousand here and a few thousand there, always careful to keep individual transactions small enough that they wouldn't trigger automatic audits. But over time those small thefts added up to $400,000, siphoned from Monroe Properties into personal accounts, offshore holdings, and cash withdrawals. She's got a serious gambling problem. Nina explained, showing me credit card statements from a casino rewards program. She's been flying to Vegas twice a month and losing tens of thousands per trip. She's also been funding Victor Brennan's lifestyle, bought him a Porsche, paid off his credit cards, set him up in a luxury condo. Your sister is systematically bankrupting the family business to support her addictions and her boyfriend. Graham spread more documents across his desk. These ones related to the will. Had hired a handwriting expert named Dr. Phyllis Keene, a forensic document examiner who testified in court cases and had a reputation for being meticulous and unbiased. Dr. Keene had analyzed my mother's signature on the will compared to authenticated samples from other documents, and her report concluded with 98% certainty that the will signature was a forgery. The signature was traced. Graham explained, showing me the expert's annotated comparison. Someone put an authentic signature under a light box or scanned it and traced over it, but they couldn't perfectly replicate the natural pressure variations and microtremors that occur in genuine handwriting. Your mother never signed this will. Someone forged it after she died, or while she was unconscious. The security footage Graham had obtained told an even darker story. He'd gotten access to the recordings from the gated community where my parents lived, using connections from his years in Portland business circles, and we sat in his office watching grainy videos of the mansion's driveway during my mother's final month. Victor Brennan's distinctive red Tesla appeared in the footage more than 20 times, usually during midday when I was at work and my mother was alone with hospice care. On 3 separate occasions, the video showed Victor entering the house carrying a briefcase and leaving 20 or 30 minutes later. The most damning footage was dated 4 days before my mother died, showing Victor entering the house at 11 in the morning when the hospice nurse was on her lunch break and leaving 45 minutes later looking satisfied with himself. That's when I think he forged the signature, Graham said, pausing the video on a frame showing Victor's face. Your mother was heavily medicated by that point, probably unconscious most of the time. He had access to the house, he had time alone, and he had the expertise from his previous fraud cases. I think he went into your mother's study, found documents with her signature, and created the forged will right there in the house. The timeline matched perfectly with when Malcolm Fletcher, the family attorney, claimed to have received the final version of the will. According to his records, the will was delivered to his office by courier on the exact day this security footage showed Victor leaving the mansion. But the betrayal went even deeper than Bethany and Victor. Nina had discovered financial records showing a $200,000 payment from Bethany to Uncle Hugh labeled as a consulting fee, paid just 1 week after the will reading. Your uncle was paid to support her story, Nina explained, highlighting the transaction. He witnessed the embezzlement accusations against you knowing they were false. He backed up Bethany's claims about you being unstable and untrustworthy. He was complicit in destroying your reputation, and he did it for $200,000. The discovery hurt more than I wanted to admit because Uncle Hugh had been part of my childhood, had taught me to ride a bike, and had helped me with math homework, and knowing he'd sold me out for money made me question every relationship I'd ever had. We spent hours going through evidence, building a case that proved beyond doubt what Bethany had done. The forged will, the embezzlement frame-up, the systematic theft from Monroe Properties, the conspiracy with Victor Brennan, Uncle Hugh's paid participation. It was overwhelming in its scope and calculation, and I found myself simultaneously impressed by and disgusted with how thoroughly my sister had orchestrated my destruction. Graham and Nina were excited, talking about going to the police and filing lawsuits and watching Bethany face criminal charges, but I felt strangely empty. Proving she was a criminal didn't undo the damage she'd caused. It didn't give me back the years I'd sacrificed or the relationship with my parents I'd never really had. What do we do with all this? I asked, gesturing at the evidence spread across multiple tables. Graham looked at me seriously. We have 2 options. We can go to the police right now with this evidence and press charges. Bethany would likely be arrested for fraud, forgery, embezzlement, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Victor would face charges too. Uncle Hugh might avoid prison but he'd pay massive fines and restitution. He paused, letting that sink in. Or we can be strategic. We can set a trap and make Bethany incriminate herself publicly in a way that leaves no room for her to worm out of consequences. The second option is riskier but more satisfying. Nina jumped in, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of a well-executed plan. Here is what I'm thinking. Bethany feels like she's won. Shay's got the inheritance. Shay's got the business. She thinks you're completely destroyed. People who feel invincible make mistakes. If we can get her to confess or to take one more aggressive action that proves her guilt, we can destroy her entire defense before she even knows she's in trouble. I thought about Bethany's smirk in the attorney's office, her fake sympathy while evicting me, her calculated cruelty in framing me for embezzlement. I thought about how she'd always gotten away with everything because she was beautiful and charming and people wanted to believe her lies. Set the trap, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. I want her to incriminate herself. I want everyone to see who she really is. Playing defeated was harder than I expected, because every instinct screamed at me to fight back immediately, to march into Monroe Properties and expose Bethany in front of everyone, to call Uncle Hugh and rage at him for his betrayal. But Graham and Nina convinced me that patience would yield better results, so I spent the next month pretending to be broken. I took temp jobs through an agency, answering phones and filing paperwork for offices that needed short-term help, and I lived in my depressing studio apartment like someone who'd given up on ever having a real life again. I avoided anywhere I might run into Bethany or her friends, stayed off social media, and generally made myself invisible. From the outside, I looked like exactly what Bethany wanted me to be: defeated, humiliated, and no longer a threat. Then one afternoon I received a certified letter delivered to my apartment, and opening it felt like being punched in the stomach all over again. It was a restraining order, filed by Bethany through her lawyer Vernon Cross, claiming I had been harassing and threatening her. The petition included screenshots of text messages it allegedly sent, messages saying things like, "You'll pay for what you did and I'm going to make you suffer, and you stole everything from me and I won't let you get away with it." I stared at those messages with confusion turning to rage because Id never sent them, had deliberately avoided all contact with Bethany for weeks, and these were obviously fabricated just like the embezzlement records. But attached to the petition were sworn statements from two witnesses, Victor Brennan, claiming he'd personally heard me threaten Bethany at a restaurant, and Uncle Hugh, claiming Id called him in a rage and made threatening statements about my sister. The restraining order had already been granted by a judge based on Bethany's petition and the fake evidence. I was now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Bethany, from contacting her in any way, from entering Monroe Properties offices, and from attempting communication through third parties. Violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and jail time. I called Graham in a panic, and he came to my apartment with Nina to review the documents. "This is actually good for us," Nina said, though her expression suggested she understood how it didn't feel good. "She's escalating, which means she's worried. People don't go to this extreme unless they're afraid you're going to expose them." But the restraining order was just the beginning of Bethany's new campaign. Over the next 2 weeks, I discovered she'd been systematically contacting everyone in my professional and personal circles, spreading a narrative of my supposed mental breakdown. She called former colleagues from Monroe Properties and told them I'd become unstable after our parents died, that I'd developed paranoid delusions about being cheated out of inheritance, that I'd made threats serious enough to require legal protection. She reached out to people I'd gone to college with and spun stories about how worried she was about me, how I'd always struggled with mental health issues she'd tried to hide out of family loyalty. She posted on social media with carefully worded messages about protecting yourself from toxic family members and the importance of setting boundaries, never naming me directly but making it obvious who she meant. The smear campaign was devastatingly effective. Friends I'd had for years stopped responding to my calls and texts. Professional contacts who'd always been warm suddenly had no time to meet for coffee. I watched my reputation dissolve in real time as Bethany's lies spread through overlapping social networks, each retelling, adding new embellishments until I barely recognized the monster she was describing. According to her version of events, I was a bitter, unstable woman who'd been fired for theft and was now stalking my successful sister out of jealousy. The truth didn't matter because Bethany's story was more compelling, fit better with people's tendency to believe the worst, and came from someone who'd spent her life perfecting the art of manipulation. The professional sabotage hit hardest when I finally had a breakthrough with a job opportunity. An architecture firm called Henderson Associates had an opening for a project coordinator, which was below my skill level but would get my foot back in the industry I'd dreamed about. I made it through 3 rounds of interviews, connected with the hiring manager, and felt genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. The HR director called and offered me the position, pending background checks and references, and I hung up feeling like maybe my life was finally turning around. 24 hours later, the HR director called back with an apology in her voice, and withdrew the offer. When I pressed for an explanation, she was vague and uncomfortable, mentioning something about concerns raised during the reference check process. I called Graham immediately, and he made some calls to contacts in the architecture community. What he discovered made my blood boil. Bethany had somehow learned about my job application, probably by monitoring my LinkedIn profile or through mutual connections, and had called Henderson Associates directly. She'd posed as a concerned former employer providing a reference, and she'd told them I'd been terminated from Monroe Properties for embezzlement. Shed described me as having substance abuse problems and a history of erratic behavior. Shed suggested they do a thorough background check because I might have legal issues they should know about. Vernon Cross had followed up with a call from his law office, ostensibly as Bethany's attorney, confirming the embezzlement and mentioning the restraining order as evidence of my threatening behavior. Henderson Associates, not wanting to take on a risky employee, had withdrawn their offer and blacklisted my application. My savings were down to $12,000, barely enough for 2 more months of rent and food, and the temp agencies were running out of assignments. Medical bills were piling up because the stress had triggered migraines and stomach problems that required doctor visits I couldn't afford. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse, where every escape route was blocked by Bethany's machinations and her seemingly unlimited resources for destroying me. I'd been so careful to follow Graham and Nina's plan, to let Bethany think Shed won, but it was costing me everything I had left. Then Bethany posted a photo on Instagram that made me want to scream. It showed her standing in the mansion's grand foyer, the chandelier sparkling behind her, and afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing designer clothes and holding a glass of champagne, and the caption read, "Grateful for everything Mom and Dad gave me. Some people are blessed with family who truly understood them. Missing you both every day." The comments section filled with sympathy and admiration. People telling her how strong she was and how she deserved all her success. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. My sister's smug smile etched into my brain, and I understood this wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about erasing me completely. About rewriting history so thoroughly that nobody would ever believe my version of events. I called Graham crying, ready to abandon the plan and just survive however I could. She's destroyed everything. What's the point of fighting when she controls the narrative and has unlimited resources? Graham let me vent without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, he said something that changed my perspective. "She's terrified of you, Lydia. People who aren't scared don't go to these lengths. Every action she's taken in the past month proves she knows you're a threat, and she's trying to eliminate that threat before you can retaliate. That means we're close to something that frightens her." Nina got on the line and added, "People who commit this many aggressive acts are usually covering something even bigger. We need to keep digging because whatever she's really hiding, it's worth all this effort to keep you from finding it." They convinced me to hold on a little longer, to trust that Bethany's overconfidence would be her downfall. I agreed, mostly because I had nothing left to lose and spite was a powerful motivator, and we refocused on gathering the final pieces of evidence we'd need to destroy her completely. Nina Sawyer's investigation took an unexpected turn when she managed to get a legal subpoena for Victor Brennan's financial records, using connections with a judge who owed Graham a favor from decades past. What she discovered sent our investigation in a direction I hadn't anticipated. Victor wasn't just Bethany's boyfriend and co-conspirator. He was a professional con artist with a documented history of targeting wealthy families during vulnerable transitions. Nina found court records from 2 previous cases in California and Nevada, where Victor had been sued by families claiming he'd manipulated elderly relatives and stolen inheritances. Both cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, which explained why his record appeared clean on surface-level searches, but the patterns were identical to what had happened with my mother. "Has done this before," Nina explained, spreading out the case files Shed obtained through legal channels. In 2018, he dated a woman in San Francisco whose father was dying of Alzheimer's. The father's will mysteriously changed in the final month of his life, leaving everything to the daughter and her new boyfriend. In 2020, he was involved with a widow in Las Vegas whose will was altered to benefit him directly. In both cases, family members contested the wills but settled because Victor had good lawyers and enough legitimate-looking documentation to make court battles expensive and uncertain. She pulled up photos from those cases, showing Victor with different women, always charming and handsome and positioned next to wealth he was systematically stealing. The interesting thing is that in both previous cases, Victor eventually turned on his partners once the money was secure. In San Francisco, he convinced the daughter to give him power of attorney over her inheritance, and then cleaned out her accounts and disappeared. In Las Vegas, Head actually married the widow and filed for divorce 6 months later with a settlement that took half her assets. Nina looked at me meaningfully. "I don't think Bethany realizes she's being played. I think she believes Victor loves her and they're partners in this scheme, but his pattern suggests he's planning to take everything and leave her with nothing. Graham saw an opportunity in this information. If we can get Victor to turn on Bethany, if we can make him understand that we know his history and we're about to expose him, he might save himself by testifying against her. It was a risky strategy because career criminals rarely cooperated without immunity deals and careful negotiation, but we were running out of time and options. Graham reached out through intermediaries, letting word filter back to Victor that we had evidence of his previous cons and were prepared to bring charges that could send him to prison for decades. The pressure was designed to make him panic, and panic makes people act irrationally. Meanwhile, we set up the main trap for Bethany. Nina discovered that Bethany was planning to sell Monroe Properties entirely. Already in negotiations with a real estate investment firm that wanted to buy the company for $6 million. Bethany would pocket most of that as majority shareholder, liquidating the business my parents and Graham had built over decades. But completing the sale required board approval, and Shed called an emergency board meeting for the following week to push through the vote. It was the perfect opportunity to confront her publicly with evidence she couldn't deny, in front of witnesses Shed thought were allies, with no escape route. Graham reached out to Uncle Hugh separately, wearing a hidden recording device during their meeting at a coffee shop. Uncle Hugh had been visibly nervous since the restraining order situation, probably sensing that Bethany's escalating behavior might drag him into legal trouble he hadn't anticipated. Graham played on that fear, asking pointed questions about the $200,000 payment and the false testimony Hugh had provided. "I know Bethany paid you to back up her story about Lydia," Graham said quietly, his tone more sad than angry. "I know you witnessed accusations of embezzlement knowing they were lies. I need you to understand that when this comes out, and it will come out, you're facing criminal charges as an accessory to fraud unless you cooperate now." Uncle Hugh broke faster than I expected, his guilty conscience apparently gnawing at him for weeks. "Bethany told me Lydia was trying to steal the inheritance that rightfully belonged to her," he said, his voice shaking. "She said Lydia had always been jealous and was planning to contest the will with false accusations. I thought I was protecting the family by supporting Bethany's version of events. The money was supposed to be compensation for my time, and the discomfort of testifying if things went to court." He admitted everything on the recording. That Head known the embezzlement charges were fabricated, that Head agreed to provide false witness statements in exchange for payment, that Head helped Bethany build her case against me, knowing it was based on lies. The confession was clear and damning, exactly what we needed. The day of the board meeting arrived, and I felt strangely calm despite everything riding on the next few hours. Graham, Nina, and a lawyer named Howard Preston who specialized in corporate litigation met me outside the Monroe Properties building. Wed prepared meticulously, organizing evidence into presentations that would be impossible to refute, anticipating Bethany's defenses and preparing counter-arguments. Howard would handle the legal aspects while Graham and Nina presented the financial evidence, and I would simply tell the truth about what had happened. We walked into the building together, and I felt the eyes of former colleagues tracking our movement through the lobby with confused curiosity. The conference room where the board meeting was being held looked exactly as I remembered, and sitting around the table were Bethany, Uncle Hugh looking pale and miserable, Doris Hartwell, with her usual neutral expression, and the two business advisors whose loyalty had always been to money rather than people. Bethany was mid-sentence, explaining her proposal to sell Monroe Properties to the investment firm, when I walked through the door with my team behind me. Her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, anger, and finally a calculating coldness as she decided how to play this. "You can't be here," she said, her voice sharp. "There's a restraining order. I'm calling security and having you arrested." But Howard Preston stepped forward, introducing himself as my attorney and placing a legal document on the table. The restraining order was based on fabricated evidence, specifically falsified text messages and perjured witness statements. "We're filing a motion to dissolve the order based on new evidence, and we've been given judicial permission for Miss Monroe to attend this board meeting specifically to address matters of corporate fraud." He was bluffing slightly about the judicial permission, but Bethany didn't know that, and her lawyer Vernon Cross wasn't present to advise her. Nina took over, setting up her laptop and projecting her forensic audit onto the conference room screen. "I'm Nina Sawyer, a certified forensic accountant, and I've been hired to conduct an independent audit of Monroe Properties' finances. What I've discovered is extensive fraud committed by Bethany Monroe over the past 2 years. She walked through the evidence methodically. The $400,000 in stolen funds, the shell accounts and fake vendor payments, the gambling losses and personal expenses disguised as business costs. The board members leaned forward, studying the spreadsheets and bank records with growing alarm, and Uncle Hugh wouldn't look at anyone. Then Nina addressed the embezzlement charges that had been used to fire me. The $50,000 Bethany claimed Lydia stole never existed. Summit Solutions LLC, the vendor allegedly paid with Lydia's authorization, is a ghost company with no business registration or tax identification. The transfer records showing Lydia's signature are forgeries. Meanwhile, the real theft, committed by Bethany herself, totals 8 times that amount and is thoroughly documented in these financial records. She clicked through screens showing the evidence, leaving no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Graham stepped forward next, and I saw Bethany recognize him with a flash of fear. He presented the handwriting analysis of my mother's signature on the will, explaining Dr. Kiane's conclusions that it was a traced forgery. He showed the security footage of Victor Brennan entering and leaving the mansion during my mother's final weeks, including the damning video from 4 days before her death, when had been alone in the house with access to her study. "Your mother never signed that will," Graham said, looking directly at Bethany. "Victor Brennan forged it while she was unconscious, probably with your knowledge and assistance, and you've been covering up that crime ever since." Then came the recording of Uncle Hugh's confession, his voice filling the conference room, as he admitted taking payment from Bethany, providing false testimony, and helping frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Uncle Hugh's face went gray as he listened to his own words, realizing his complicity was now part of the permanent record. Doris Hartwell gasped, her neutral facade cracking, and the business advisors exchanged glances that suggested they were calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from this disaster. Bethany tried to deny everything, her voice rising in pitch as she claimed fabricated evidence that this was a conspiracy by bitter family members who couldn't accept our parents' final wishes. But Victor Brennan's betrayal came at the worst possible moment for her. Graham revealed that Victor had been contacted by investigators and had agreed to provide testimony in exchange for a plea deal. Victor, seeing the walls closing in and recognizing the pattern from his previous cons that led to prison time, had decided to save himself by admitting everything. Had turned over documents showing how he and Bethany had planned the will forgery, emails discussing their strategy, text messages about manipulating my mother during her final days. The final blow came when Graham played a video clip obtained through Victor's cooperation, taken on Victor's phone during one of his visits to the mansion. It showed Bethany in my mother's study going through documents, and the audio captured her saying to Victor, "Once Mom's gone and the will goes through, everything belongs to me. Lydia won't get a single dollar, and there's nothing she can do about it. I've earned this by being the favorite my whole life." The video had a timestamp of 10 days before my mother's death, proving premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Bethany's defense collapsed completely. She started screaming, no longer the composed society woman but a cornered animal lashing out. Mom was going to leave everything to Lydia. She told me after Dad died that she realized Shed neglected her older daughter and wanted to make it right. I deserved that inheritance. I was the one who performed for them my whole life, who played the perfect daughter while Lydia just existed. The narcissistic core of her worldview came pouring out in a rant that condemned her more thoroughly than any evidence could. Shed felt entitled to everything, had viewed my parents' love as something Shed earned through manipulation and performance, and she genuinely couldn't understand why I deserved equal treatment. The board voted unanimously to remove Bethany as a shareholder and officer of Monroe Properties based on her admitted theft and fraud. Howard Preston had already contacted the Portland police, and 2 officers arrived within minutes to arrest both Bethany and Victor on multiple charges: fraud, forgery, embezzlement, elder abuse, conspiracy, and perjury. They handcuffed Bethany right there in the conference room while she screamed threats and accusations, blaming me for everything that was happening as if I'd forced her to commit crimes. Victor went quietly, already thinking about plea deals and reduced sentences, his charm finally useless. Uncle Hugh resigned from the board immediately and wrote a check for $200,000 as restitution, his hands shaking so badly he could barely sign his name. I watched my sister being led away by police and felt nothing but exhaustion. This wasn't victory. It was just the end of a nightmare that had cost me more than she could ever repay. 3 months after Bethany's arrest, I sat in a courtroom and watched her plead guilty to multiple felonies as part of a negotiated agreement with prosecutors. Shed initially tried to fight the charges, convinced she could charm her way out of consequences the way Shed charmed her way through life, but her lawyer eventually convinced her that the evidence was overwhelming and a trial would only result in a longer sentence. She pleaded guilty to fraud, forgery, embezzlement, elder abuse conspiracy, and making false statements, and the judge sentenced her to 4 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 3. Victor Brennan, who'd cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Bethany, received 6 years in a plea deal that still seemed too lenient given his history. Uncle Hugh avoided prison through his early cooperation and restitution, but he paid massive fines and lost his reputation in Portland's business community, becoming a cautionary tale about greed and family betrayal. The legal resolution of my parents' estate took longer, but reached the conclusion Graham had predicted from the beginning. The forged will was invalidated by the court, and investigators found the original will in my mother's safe deposit box, exactly where it should have been. Just as Graham suspected, the authentic will split the estate equally between Bethany and me, 50-50 on everything including the mansion, the business shares, and the financial accounts. But since Bethany had already sold the mansion for under market value and spent or stolen much of the liquid assets, her half was seized by the court to pay restitution to Monroe Properties, legal fees, and fines associated with her crimes. By the time everything was settled, I inherited approximately $5 million. Half the value from the mansion sale, full ownership of Monroe Properties after Bethany's shares were forfeited, and half the remaining investment accounts. The money should have felt like vindication, like proof that it'd been right all along and justice had prevailed, but mostly it just felt heavy. I bought a modest townhouse in a quiet Portland suburb, nothing like the mansion I'd grown up in but comfortable and truly mine. I invested most of the inheritance conservatively, living off the income while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life now that survival wasn't consuming all my energy. The financial security was real and I was grateful for it, but it didn't erase the years I'd lost or the family relationships that had been revealed as hollow performances. Monroe Properties presented a difficult decision. The business my parents and Graham had built represented decades of work, but it also represented everything toxic about my family's values. After long conversations with Graham, I decided not to keep my ownership stake. Too many painful memories were attached to that company. Too much of my sacrifice and suffering tied to those office buildings and tenant relationships. Graham offered to buy my shares for a fair price, and I accepted. Watching him take control of the company he'd helped found 30 years ago. He renamed it to remove the Monroe name entirely, transforming it into a business with ethical foundations and employee ownership principles. Sometimes I drive past the office building and see the new name on the sign, and I feel relieved rather than regretful. I used a portion of my inheritance to start my own small architecture firm, finally pursuing the dream I'd abandoned when I was 22 to work for my family. I named it Lydia Monroe Design, a firm focused on affordable housing and community spaces rather than luxury developments and maximum profit margins. I hired Nina Sawyer as my chief financial officer, because we'd become genuine friends through the investigation, and I trusted her completely. The firm started small, just 3 of us working out of a rented office. But within a year, we'd won a contract to design a low-income housing complex that would provide quality homes for families who'd been priced out of Portland's ridiculous rental market. The work felt meaningful in a way Monroe Properties never had, creating spaces that actually helped people, rather than extracting maximum value from every transaction. Therapy became a regular part of my life as I processed the trauma of the past year and the deeper wounds from my childhood. My therapist helped me understand that my parents had been narcissists who'd created a toxic family dynamic by pitting Bethany and me against each other, valuing performance over authenticity and manipulation over genuine connection. Bethany had been damaged by being the golden child just as I'd been damaged by being invisible, twisted by constant reinforcement that her worth came from being special and admired. It didn't excuse her crimes, or make me forgive what she'd done, but it helped me understand that we'd both been victims of the same dysfunctional system, even though our wounds looked different. My therapist asked if I wanted to visit Bethany in prison, to try for some kind of reconciliation or closure, and I said no without hesitation. Some bridges should stay burned, some relationships shouldn't be salvaged, and I had no obligation to forgive someone who deliberately tried to destroy me. The lessons I learned through this nightmare changed how I saw the world and my place in it. I learned that being strong doesn't mean accepting mistreatment silently, that people who exploit your strength don't deserve your loyalty, and that family members who say they love you can be the most dangerous people in your life. I learned that fighting back isn't cruel when you're defending yourself against deliberate harm, that preserving your peace sometimes means cutting toxic people out entirely, and that you're not obligated to maintain relationships with people who consistently hurt you. I learned that inheritance isn't really about money but about value and worth, about whether the people who raised you saw you as a person deserving of respect or as a tool to be used and discarded. I thought often about my mother's last words to me. "You're so strong, Lydia. You'll be fine no matter what." Shed meant it as a dismissal, as justification for leaving me nothing while giving Bethany everything, as if my strength meant I didn't deserve support or security or acknowledgement. But I decided to take those words as truth in a different way. I was strong, not because I endured abuse silently or sacrificed myself for people who didn't value me, but because I fought back when fighting was necessary. I was strong enough to expose lies even when telling the truth was terrifying. I was strong enough to rebuild my life from nothing. I was strong enough to define my own worth instead of accepting the value others assigned me. My mother accidentally told me the truth about who I was, and I claimed that truth on my own terms. 1 year after Bethany's sentencing, my life looked nothing like Id imagined it would. My architecture firm had grown to 5 employees and multiple ongoing projects. Id designed an affordable housing complex that won a city award for innovative community design. I was dating Graham casually, both of us too damaged by our experiences to rush into anything serious but enjoying each other's company and shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild after betrayal. I had no contact with Bethany, who wrote letters from prison that I burned without reading because I owed her nothing, not even the courtesy of acknowledging her attempts at manipulation. Uncle Hugh tried to apologize through intermediaries, but I refused to meet with him because some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and I had no interest in making him feel better about his choices. Peace came slowly and didn't look like happiness exactly, but it looked like contentment and purpose and authenticity. I no longer performed for people who didn't value me. I no longer sacrificed my needs for family members who exploited my sense of duty. I no longer carried the weight of being the strong one who was expected to endure anything without complaint. I was free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my first 32 years, free to build a life based on my actual values rather than other people's expectations, free to pursue work that mattered, and relationships that were genuine. The final settlement from the estate arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A certified letter from Malcolm Fletcher's office informing me that all legal matters related to my parents' estate were now closed, and I had no further obligations or entanglements with the Monroe family legacy. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and burned it in my townhouse fireplace. I watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash, watched the smoke carry away the last tangible connection to everything that had been taken from me, and everything Id fought to reclaim. When the fire died down, I sat there on my couch with a cup of tea and smiled, a genuine smile that came from somewhere deep and real, and I realized I was finally free. Not free because Id won, though I suppose I had won in the objective sense of reclaiming my inheritance and exposing the truth. Free because Id stopped letting my parents' judgment define my worth. Free because Id walked away from a family that had never really seen me as valuable. Free because Id built a life that was truly mine, not a performance for an audience that would never appreciate it. My parents cut me out of the will and said I was strong enough without them, and they were right in a way they never intended. I was strong enough to leave them all behind, strong enough to survive their betrayal, and strong enough to transform that survival into a life worth living. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever had your strength used as an excuse to treat you poorly? Drop your story in the comments because I want to hear it. I want to know I'm not alone in this experience. And maybe your story will help someone else who's going through something similar. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt seen or validated or inspired to stand up for yourself, smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories about surviving toxic families and rebuilding after betrayal, because trust me, there are plenty more where this came from. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community where we tell the truth about family dysfunction instead of pretending everything's perfect. Remember that you're stronger than you think, you deserve better than you've been accepting, and sometimes the best inheritance is the freedom to walk away. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next video.